Continuing chapter on biological molecules, we're moving into lipids. And lipids are fats and oils and waxes and a whole bunch of things like that. We'll get to a short list of possible uses. But there's two basic parts to a lipid. There's this little piece, 1, 2, 3 carbons. This is glycerol. This is kind of the core piece of the molecule. And then attached to each of the C's is a long string. Length is highly variable on these. And these are fatty acids. So there's your fatty acid. I was going to let you write it all down, but I was on. Now here's where it gets a little bit dicey. This would be considered a saturated fatty acid. Even though there is a double bond there, it's not a double bond between the carbons. And remember I said that when you've got a string and you get a double bond, it kinks the string. So this is saturated, this is unsaturated. That double bond could put, see how these are all CH2, each one of those is CH. So depends on where the double bond is. It's really in the carbon-carbon bonds. These are generally hydrophobic. You'll notice from the list I gave you of fats and oils and waxes that these are materials that don't tend to mix well with water. In living things, some of the uses include water barriers. In cell membranes. In cell membranes, you've got a phospholipid. It's got 2 fatty acids, one of which is kinked. Attached actually over here is a phosphate group. So you've got one end of the molecule that is hydrophobic. These are not particularly polar. And then a part of the molecule that's hydrophilic. And you wind up with the phosphate group facing the outside of the cell, and then there's another layer with the phosphate group down in the bottom facing the inside of the cell, facing the water sides. And then you've got these sandwiched in between, producing a hydrophobic layer for your membrane to produce a water barrier between the outside water and the inside water. But, as I mentioned before, waxes are lipids, oils are lipids. There's many, many, many different materials that that use one sort of lipid or another as a water barrier. Because it's hydrophobic, a blob of fat is kind of inert. It doesn't really mix with the chemicals around it because they're in water and the water isn't getting into a blob of fat. That makes it a good repository for those long strings of carbons, which can be broken down and fed into respiratory sequences, processes. And so long-term energy storage is a very good use of fats. Not the only use, but it's pretty good. That's why we get, if we take in more calories than we're using, we will store some of that energy as starches where we can get it quickly and then store some of the energy, once the starches are kind of filled up, store some of the energy in fats, and we don't go after that quickly. Is that your body will go into your starch storage in your liver and your muscles to some extent before they'll go after your fat storage. That's why people that are trying to reduce their fat are put on low or no carb diets because you're not feeding any more carbohydrates into your body. You'll eventually deplete your starch storage, and then you have to go, when you need energy, have to go into your fats, and you could go into your proteins too, and you will to some extent. But for the most part, if you have fat available, you're going into the fat. Going into the fat, you're breaking down fatty acids. Going into the proteins, you're breaking down amino acids. In some rare cases, people on crash carb diets do wind up acidifying their plasma, beyond the safe pH. That can be dangerous. Most people can handle it, but some people can't. Oops, that's supposed to be a B. In some cases, we, as animals, will build up fat around particularly vulnerable objects. Our eyes have a layer of fat between your fluid-filled eyeball and the bony casing of your eye socket, so that it's not easy to bounce your eyes in. Is that the fat compresses. It absorbs the impact so that you're not whacking into the bone. There's generally fat around testicles that can absorb some of the shock. And you do find other places where they're used as shock absorbers. In animals that produce their own heat, they can be used fat can be used as insulation. Metabolically, it's pretty expensive insulation. Hair, feathers, things with little air pockets in them, much more metabolically cheap. But if you're a deep diver, then having an insulator with air pockets in it, the air gets compressed out of it if you go below 10 meters of water. So deep divers tend to use blubber as an insulator, because heat doesn't move through the blubber. Well, it's a good insulator. But if you're not producing heat, you don't really need to be insulated. Cell membranes are made out of lipids. Sometimes you want to get a message into the cell pretty quickly. And so you package the message in a molecule that doesn't see a cell membrane, a lipid barrier, as a barrier. It can move right through. So there are different types of messenger molecules, including steroid hormones, that are lipid-based. There are protein-based hormones. We'll talk about those when we get to proteins. But there's lipid-based hormones. Protein-based hormones have to kind of politely ask the cell to respond. It attaches to receptors on the outside. We'll talk about that later in the semester. Steroid hormones go right inside and interact with the part of the cell it needs to have do something. In some cases, steroid hormones go right in and activate genes. Okay, we need this from the cell. Let's go turn the gene on. But you need something that can move through the membrane like it's not a barrier. There are some other kinds of messenger molecules. Pheromones sometimes are lipid-based. They're released into the air, so the hydrophobic part isn't that big a deal. We also will make chemical weapons that are at least somewhat lipid-based, because we want them to penetrate through people's skin. Is that people figured out pretty quickly wear gas masks against gas attacks. So they needed a better influx into the body. They need to get through the skin. Is something that's somewhat lipid-based. Pesticides are often lipid-based as well. way to get into pests. So they're commercial molecules that follow this same sort of, let's get it through the membranes to get it where we want it to go. Okay, that's it for lipids. It's a fairly short thing.